Welcome to meeting number 24 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedure and House Affairs. I'm going to go through some of the formal remarks just because we've had so many changes of membership, perhaps changes in staff, and then slowly I'll reduce my intro remarks once everybody is comfortable with what is happening today, and especially when for the benefit of the witnesses we have before us today. So today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of January 25th, 2021, and therefore members are attending in person. Actually, today I don't believe we have any members in the room, correct, Justin?
That's correct. No members in the room.
Okay. All right. Perfect. So today we will have members attending and witnesses using remotely on the Zoom application, and the proceedings will be made available via the House of Commons website. So you're aware, the webcast will always show the person speaking at the time, not the entirety of the committee. So hopefully right now you have your screen turned to the grid view, so you can view everyone, but that is not how it's going to be webcasted, but is the best format for you to use in real time so that it feels as much as possible like a real committee meeting. Today's meeting is also taking place on the Zoom webinar format. Webinars are for public committee meetings and are available only to members, their staff, and to witnesses. Members may have remarked that the entry of the meeting was much more quicker and that they immediately entered as an active participant. With the exception of a few technical difficulties we've had this morning, all functionalities for active participants remain the same. Staff will be non-active participants only and can therefore only view the meeting in gallery view. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind all participants to this meeting that screenshots or taking photos of your screen is not permitted. And given the ongoing pandemic situation and in light of the recommendations from health authorities to remain a healthy and safe distance from all those attending the meeting in person, since there's no members or witnesses there. Just a reminder, I guess, to all of the staff in the room as well. As chair, I will be enforcing these measures for the duration of the meeting and thank the members in advance for their cooperation. So since everyone is mostly participating virtually, just a reminder that to unmute and mute yourself. That won't be done for you. So remember to unmute yourself before speaking. And at the bottom, you can choose either for English or French for interpretation. And you don't apparently anymore have to switch between the two when you change languages. So hopefully that works. You can stay on floor if you're planning on switching between languages. You don't have to jump from English to French. For members participating in, well, I guess nobody's participating in person, so I will keep a list of those that have a point of order through the raise hand function at the bottom of your screen. So if there's a point of order, please raise your hand using the toolbar. And today, for the first half of the meeting from 11 to 12, we have witnesses, and I'd like to welcome before us today Mr. Professor Dwayne Bratt, Professor of Political Science at Mount Royal University, and we have Professor Patrick Talion, Professor and Faculty of Law at Laval University. Before hearing from the witnesses, who both have opening statements, I'd like to let members know that following the panel with the witnesses, we will have an election of the first vice chair, a position that fell vacant once Mr. Doherty had left the PROC committee. So hopefully we'll be able to do that right after this panel. And then we will follow that with going in camera. You've been provided a link in the email that was sent. So switch to in camera after that, because we will be continuing with our draft report on the election COVID-19 study. And once that study is completed, or once the draft is completed and approved, we will move on, hopefully, if we have some time left, into committee business so that I can update you on the prorogation study. Okay, so without further ado, I don't know who would like to begin first, but maybe we can begin with Professor Bratt. If you could start with your opening statements, please.
Okay, thank you. Hopefully everybody can hear me. It's been a while since the mic check. I will read my, thank you for the committee for inviting me, and I actually appreciate doing this by Zoom, so I didn't have to fly to Ottawa. As much as I enjoy Ottawa, I will read my opening statement, and then I can flesh it out during the question period. So prorogation is an important parliamentary tool. It allows for a government reset in between elections. However, the tool that can and has been abused by governments, particularly when they were in a minority situation. Before getting to the matter of August 2020, I would give a short list of recent and controversial prorogations by both Liberal and Conservative governments. In 2002, Prime Minister Jean Chrétien prorogued Parliament. This allowed Chrétien to avoid tabling a report to the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee regarding the sponsorship scandal. Unusually, this was done by a majority government, not by a minority government. Then we've got the episode in December of 2008 with Prime Minister Stephen Harper. This is probably the most controversial case in Canadian history. Harper had won a minority government weeks before, but was now facing a non-confidence vote, which he would surely lose. The other party leaders, Stéphane Dion, Jacques Layton, and Monsieur Duceppe, had signed agreements signaling their intent to defeat the government. Because it was so close to the previous election, there would likely be no fresh elections. Instead, Stéphane Dion would be permitted to form a new government. To delay the vote, Harper prorogued Parliament, and I will return to this case again. And then the third case was in January-March 2010, also by Prime Minister Stephen Harper. The stated reason was to keep Parliament in recess for the duration of the Winter Olympics in Vancouver. However, it was strongly suspected that Harper wanted to avoid ongoing investigations in the Afghan detainees affair. This case is quite similar to the August 2020 prorogue. The minority government facing with damaging committee investigations. This brings us to the August-September 2020 prorogation. The reason for the throne speech was prorogation. The official reason for the decision to prorogue Parliament was to allow a government reset to address the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic fallout. Without a doubt, this is a very valid reason and would absolutely have justified proroguing Parliament. Responding to COVID-19 probably did play a role in the decision-making that led to the decision to prorogue. However, I would argue that a much more important rationale was the WE scandal. The Canadian government had given a sole source contract to the WE charity to administer a student volunteer program. However, WE had very close ties to the families of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau and Finance Minister Bill Morneau. The scandal led to Morneau's resignation and increased scrutiny from parliamentary committees into the role of Trudeau, the Prime Minister's office, other ministers, and senior members of the public service. Proroguing suspended those investigations and allowed the Trudeau government 6 weeks to try to change the channel with Canadians. There are two key pieces of evidence that I have compiled to justify my argument. First was the timing of the prorogation. As I said, COVID-19 became an important issue in March 2020. The government responded with a series of health and unprecedented economic responses throughout the spring of 2020. If at any time in the spring of 2020, the government had decided to prorogue Parliament in order to give it more time to effectively respond to COVID-19, that would have made perfect sense. But waiting until August, and only after the WE scandal had been percolating for weeks with future bad news for the government, showed what I believe was the real political calculation. A comparison to Stephen Harper in 2008 is in order. In the fall of 2008, as the global financial crisis was hitting, that was a legitimate justification to prorogue Parliament, even though we had just had a federal election weeks before. And in fact, the new throne speech did respond to the global financial crisis. However, as I argued above, the real reason was to delay an imminent non-confidence vote in the hopes that the Liberal NDP BQ coalition would collapse. which is exactly what happened. Second was the throne speech itself. Speeches from the throne are usually a one-day story. There is some buildup, but they are usually vague visions of the future direction of the government. However, the one that the Justin Trudeau government delivered in September 2020 was supposed to be significantly different. There was speculation for weeks about its content. It would be delivered in the midst of the COVID-19 health pandemic and record levels of government spending. The speech followed Parliament's prorogation and with a looming threat of a non-confidence vote that would plunge Canada into an election. If these stakes were not high enough, Trudeau and the opposition leaders would give separate television addresses to Canadians, timed for the supper hour news in Ontario and Quebec. But sadly for those in the Western provinces like myself, it was in the afternoon and most people missed it. Unfortunately, despite the hype, there was not much substance to the speech from the throne. If the reason for prorogation was in fact COVID-19, the speech from the throne would have been laser focused on how the government would respond, both through health measures and economic responses. It would have indicated new programs and policies. Instead, the content was a rehash of previous federal programs, such as the Canadian Emergency Wage Subsidy, and promises that had been repeatedly made, such as strengthening childcare programs and creating a national pharmacare program.
Professor
These
Bratt,
could have been, yes?
How many more minutes do you have?
I will go about one more minute, please.
Okay,
These
sure.
could have been refocused as a policy response to COVID-19, but were not really. Instead, it resembled a campaign speech for the next election, which would have arrived soon after. The television address was even worse. I'll just skip over some of this stuff. But the television address was really an opportunity for Trudeau to summarize the throne speech in his own words and not the Governor General's. That had only been delivered a couple of hours previously. This was, in fact, a campaign speech. So my conclusion is, ultimately, the speech from the throne was not primarily about a reset due to COVID-19. Rather, it was an elaborate effort from the Trudeau government to distract Canadians from a political scandal. And with that, I will conclude my opening statement.
Thank you,
wait for
Professor.
questions. Thank you.
I'm sure the questions will allow you to elaborate on your points. Professor Tellion.
Thank you very much to the committee for having invited me to participate in this discussion on prorogation. I will try to be brief. My first point would be this. Prorogation is a rather controversial instrument in parliamentary law. It can be seen as a delay tactic to avoid what would normally be real conflict resolution. The strength of the parliamentary system, contrary to the presidential system, is that usually when there's a conflict between the House and the executive branch of government, it can't last. There is a way to resolve conflicts. You can use censure, that is non-confidence votes, and you can use dissolution. And who decides ultimately? The voters. Now, in some cases, you can actually denature the parliamentary system when you delay a non-confidence vote. If you use, for example, a delay tactic. Now, that's not always the case, but sometimes that can be the case. So in the summer of 2020, like in December 2008, there was a minority government. And that minority government saw the threat of a non-confidence vote. Now, in the summer of 2008, it was a less explicit threat than it was in December. And on top of that, there were parliamentary investigations into the We Charity scandal, and at a time when there was an unpredictable COVID crisis. Now, in defense of the government, one could say that the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance had, in a minimal way, collaborated with this parliamentary investigation. They had taken the time to appear before prorogation. However, that prorogation ended that investigation. Now, was that the purpose or was it the end result? It was the result in the end. Beyond this investigation, using prorogation in the summer of 2020, I think, can be criticized for another reason. The effect of this prorogation was to put the short-term interests of the government, ending an investigation, resetting, ending the study of certain bills, above a historic crisis, which I would see as being the higher interests of the Federation. What were those higher interests? Well, the higher interest was not to deprive ourselves of these parliamentary tools, not to deprive ourselves of legislative tools during a time of crisis. Over those weeks or months when the Parliament was prorogued, perhaps legislative changes would have had to be made that required voting, whether it be emergency subsidies, for example, whether it involve the use of the Emergency Measures Act. We didn't have to use that legislation, thank goodness. However, the higher interests of the Federation were to keep the parliamentary route open. Closing that route was, in fact, putting all the tools in the hands of the executive. And this was in a time of COVID. And I think that actually was confusing the interests of the government with the higher interests of the Federation itself. The government would have done better in more ways than one. First of all, by not proroguing. If there hadn't been prorogation, then there wouldn't have been that risk that it was taking. Or the government could have prorogued for a lot less time. The same effect would have taken place. The investigation, they would have put an end to the investigation. They would have been able to reset. And we wouldn't have been deprived of the parliamentary tools during a time of crisis. So in conclusion, whether a prorogation is politically motivated or not is a question of context, political context. And ultimately, it's up to parliamentarians and to voters to decide. In my humble opinion, however, using prorogation in the summer of 2020 was controversial. It was a way of avoiding a non-confidence vote, perhaps, but mainly to avoid an investigation. So there was this whole issue of confidence that was put off by having a new speech from the throne, for example, and by proroguing. I'd just like to emphasize one point in conclusion. It's very important to remember that one of the weaknesses of our parliamentary system is that the prorogation rules and the roles of the Governor-General and the Prime Minister, for example, are often vague. They're not necessarily written. These rules are not necessarily laws, they're conventions. And because we have these vague conventions and rules, rather than mitigating crises, sometimes what the outcome is that they make that crisis worse. And 2008 is a perfect example of that. The rules of the game were not clear. Our conventions are not written. And at the time, when there was that tension between a minority government, the Harper's government, and the Governor-General, because we had vague rules, In fact, the crisis was only made worse. So I will wrap up with that. I'd like to congratulate the committee on its work, and I would encourage parliamentarians to assess the idea of better codifying these tools, as has been done in New Zealand and Australia. So to codify these unwritten conventions. And perhaps as well, you shouldn't fear breaking the taboo of constitutional reform. Our institutions deserve better than perhaps closing our eyes to ways to improve them. Thank you.
Professor. We're going to keep the timing tight. Sometimes I give a little leeway, but today I don't think we have enough time. Plus the statements went over a little bit, but they were very valuable statements. So we appreciate having both the witnesses here. Mr. Nader, you have 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I would echo your comments as well. These were very useful comments from both of the distinguished academics with us today, so thank you to both of you for joining us. I might start with you, Professor Bratt. You'd made some interesting comments in your opening statements, which harked me back to the comments made by Minister Rodriguez earlier this week. He told this committee that the one and only reason for prorogation was the reset for the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, in your comments, you rightly noted that it is an important issue and one that would, in theory, be worthy of a reset. But I think you made some interesting comments about the speech itself being basically a rehash of previous announcements and not really the grand occasion that might have been envisioned for a reset. So would I be right in suggesting, or in your comments on this, that the minister may have been putting a bit of a political spin on the one and only reason, and would you agree that the primary reason was a way to get out of the difficult political situation related to we?
Well, I have no doubt that COVID was part of the decision making, but it was not, I believe, the primary driver for the reasons that I explained. I think the primary driver was to delay, try to change the channel as related to the we scandal. There's no, on a decision of this importance, there's never one single factor. The question we have to look at is what is the real driving factor as opposed to other smaller mitigating factors.
Yes, thank you for that. And to that end as well, I mean, we know that the advice to the Governor General is given rightly by the Prime Minister of the day, the only person who has the tradition and the constitutional right to provide advice to the Governor General. In this case, obviously, we have not heard directly from the Prime Minister. Would that be an avenue that you think this committee should pursue, hearing from the Prime Minister or as well as some of his senior staff?
Oh, absolutely. I did watch when the Prime Minister attended, I believe it was the Finance Committee back in July over the we scandal. I thought that was a valuable testimony. I think asking him directly about this, about his rationale, not necessarily the conversation he has with the Governor General, I think that is privileged, but what was the decision making around this, and to be able to probe some of those questions, I think absolutely.
Thank you for that. And I'll throw this next question open to both yourself and Professor Taillon as well. Are you aware of anything that would have prevented the Prime Minister from announcing at an earlier date, perhaps on August 18th, that it was his intention to request prorogation from the Governor General on a future date, closer to September, but not actually formally requested until closer to the date? I know, Professor Taillon, you made some interesting comments about putting the interests of government over the interests of Canadians, taking away the tools of Parliament during that period of time. Are either of you aware of any blockages that would have prevented the Prime Minister from announcing his intention to seek prorogation at a future date, but allowing committees in particular to continue their good work during that time period?
Personally, I don't see what might have prevented them using a shorter prorogation, and also there is nothing that prevented them from allowing parliamentary committees to continue working, and even with a prorogation, to actually collaborate with each other in order to continue the inquiries that were going on before prorogation.
Professor Barat, did you have any comments on that same topic?
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing stopping you from announcing in a press conference that you intend to prorogue, 2 weeks hence or 3 weeks hence. There's nothing stopping you from doing that. And in fact, there's nothing to prevent you from reversing that, 3 weeks later saying, we actually don't need to do this now. So there's nothing wrong with that. But I would agree with my colleague, a 6-week prorogation is quite unusual. It was a significant length of time.
Great, thank you for that. And to that end as well, there's been a fair bit of stock put in the importance of holding a confidence vote by the Prime Minister on the return after the speech from the throne. I think the official quote was, I'll read it: "Duty bound and honor bound to ensure we had continued confidence of the House." But to both of you as well, some have suggested this was almost a way of fishing for an election before the second wave hit. Would you agree that there are other procedural tools that would have been available to the government without prorogation to have a confidence vote to ensure that it's clear that they had the confidence of the House of Commons? Would you suggest there are other tools outside of prorogation to have gone that route?
They could have simply put in a resolution to the House asking for confidence. They didn't need to prorogue. They didn't need a speech from the throne. The government can declare that this item is a matter of confidence and have a vote on that. So yeah, there are other reasons that they could have done that besides proroguing. That didn't require a confidence vote.
Given the speculation of the timing of the prorogation and documents that were to be tabled almost immediately the next day, would you suggest that we look at some of the conversations that may have been held between the government and those entities that were to table documents to see what information they had prior to prorogation?
Maybe just a yes or no, please.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Luzon?
Mr. Lozon, good morning and thank you for coming. I'm going to be asking my questions in French. I hope interpretation is working. Thank you both for your testimony, for your theoretical ideas. I can see that you are passionate about your work and you've given us lengthy testimony. And I have a question for Mr. Bratt. In your remarks, you said that the pandemic was a valid reason for proroguing Parliament, but then you quickly moved on to the reason you thought Parliament was prorogued. Can you tell me why the pandemic would be a valid reason to prorogue?
Of this importance, that led to hundreds of billions of dollars in additional government spending of an unknown health pandemic that we didn't know how bad it would be, would obviously justify a reset of government to prepare for something like that. Just as the global financial crisis or a depression or a war would involve similar activities.
You also said that it would have been preferable to have that prorogation earlier in March when we learned about the pandemic. This prorogation was called in August, but how can you explain the fact that there was so much data that was amassed between March and August? So much work had been done in the field already. So how could then all that have been analyzed earlier on? There was a second wave coming. There were billions of dollars that were required, and we had to step back. Why would March would have been more important if we didn't have the necessary data and evidence, whereas in August there was an emergency situation and people were tired, they were fed up, and they wanted to finish with this pandemic?
So on the issue of timing, I never said it had to be in March. It could have been April, it could have been May, it could have been June. I think the reason that it occurred in August was because other political events like the WE scandal had emerged. So it didn't need to be right, the first day or the second day or the first week. I think if it really was about COVID, if they felt that they needed to do it in August, they could have done it in June. They could have done it in May. And so I think by doing it in August, you need to look at the timing of the other events that were circulating at that moment.
I'm putting this question out to both of you. You started, so I started asking you my questions. However, you both said that prorogation is controversial. Now, when we look at Canadian history, have there been prorogations that weren't controversial, that weren't labeled as controversial by the opposition? Yes, certainly. However, using a prorogation when you're majority parliament is less controversial because it's less of a delay tactic in a way when it comes to managing a situation like that of a minority parliament. When a government has the majority, they do have full control over parliamentary business, just about. And therefore, using prorogation is more of a way of, in fact, resetting a legislative agenda. It's an opportunity for a new speech from the throne. When you're a minority government, yes, those same reasons can exist. However, there are also those more controversial aspects. There's more the ability to use it as a delay tactic, a way of starting over where there's less confidence, where there's uncertain confidence. Well, perhaps I'll ask another question rather than hear Mr. Bratt on this as well. You also mentioned in your opening remarks that we could have done better. Well, all governments can do better. In many situations, Harper could have done better in the cases of both his prorogations. But you gave a concrete example. You spoke about a shorter time, a more limited time of prorogation. Do you remember how long the other prorogations were, for example, with Harper? Unfortunately, I do not have the dates before me. However, I will agree with you that it could have been long, especially in 2008. It was several months. So, and that is an example of a controversial prorogation. I would be even willing to say that proroguing during the summer is not the same as proroguing during the winter. However, I am agreeing with you on that. You see, if you compare months and months and months with summer months and a return to the Parliament sitting that was almost the same as it was going to be, then it's not really a 6-week-long prorogation. Now, you've raised some theoretical aspects of procedure, and you've talked about a speech from the throne and economic statements and prorogation. But I would like to know if you think you have the pulse on the ground. Do you know, when we're facing issues of seniors?
And we have Mr. Leblanc.
Thank you very much.
We've got Monsieur Thériault, 6 minutes.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Bratt, and thank you, Mr. Taillon. Your remarks have been very interesting. I have so many questions to ask of you, but I'm going to go as simply as possible. Mr. Bratt, you said that you prorogue Parliament in order to reset. You emphasized that. You also emphasized the fact that when you heard the speech from the throne, you saw that there wasn't necessarily a clean break. It was simply continuing with what had already been happening. And the Prime Minister did an address to the nation, and all he was saying was that we have to stick together and that they have to download the application. In fact, there was nothing new. So you emphasize this idea that it wasn't necessarily a reset. However, let's say the government did want to reset. Mr. Taillon, You said that shutting down Parliament was, in fact, closing an important toolbox. We were in a crisis, and Parliament was depriving itself of legislation that might help us get through the crisis. Mr. Lauzon earlier said that it was the summer and that one works less during the summer. However, I would remind Mr. Lauzon that there were 4 committees sitting. We were in the House, and opposition parties had truly cooperated in order to make sure that we were sitting as often as we could to find solutions to the pandemic. I am in the Bloc Québécois, and I know as whip that we were as the leader, we were looking for solutions together. This was a very difficult situation to manage. So ideally, if you want to reset and you don't want to deprive yourself of important opportunities to work with the executive, what should have happened is announcing prorogation on September 17th, the day before. And we were told on Tuesday that it would have been possible to do that by the witnesses who appeared here. So if the Liberal Party had put the higher interests of Canada and Quebec before its own interests, it would have done that. However, they did something else. They didn't think about the people of Canada and Quebec. And so my question is simple. August 17th, Mr. Morneau, the second most important government member, resigned. My question is this. On August 18th, there was prorogation. Was it, in fact, to save face for the Prime Minister, to save the Prime Minister himself? Well, timing does count for something, yes. And that's why I have criticized what I have. Governments are always a mix of tactics, noble intentions, and strategies. But in this case, the legislative toolbox shouldn't have been closed for so long. Because it's as if you're building an airplane while it's flying. You need tools. And even with those tools, it was very difficult to tackle the crisis. So if on top of that, you throw overboard some of those tools that the government has, obviously there are the provinces and there's the executive, yes, and there are those tools. However, there are many tools in the parliamentary toolbox, and I think that was putting the interests of the government before the higher interests of the Federation. Now, I agree that summer is usually less busy, but these weren't normal times. And that's why I'm emphasizing the length of the prorogation during a crisis. And I think that is the main criticism I would have of the government in this case.
I would add a couple extra points. Back in the 1980s, the Mulroney government had a one-day prorogation, right? So you can do something like that. You can have a 1 day or a 2 day prorogation. You didn't need 6 weeks. The timing is absolutely important. You cannot divorce Bill Morneau's resignation from his implication in WE. Think of that committee meeting when he announced that he had written a check to the WE charity for $45,000 hours before testifying, right? That's pretty damning. And so what happened after the prorogation? What was the coverage? It was about prorogation. It was less about Morneau's resignation for the ostensible reason of seeking this job at the OECD, which has quickly collapsed.
Alors, donc, si je reviens.
So let's go back to August 17th when Mr. Morneau resigned, and August 18th, the House was prorogued. Clearly, the reason wasn't because of the economic and COVID crisis. It was simply to protect the interests of the Prime Minister. I think that's clearer than ever, given your respective testimonies. Now, with respect to the Prime Minister's speech, actually, before that, I am the leader for the Bloc Québécois in the House, the government House leader. And there are other House leaders as well. Over the course of the summer, we were working together to improve the steps being taken by the government, and we were, in fact, building this plane while we were flying. And in fact, we set aside our political differences so that we could work together for the sake of the community. But unfortunately, that's not what the Liberal Party did on August 18th. That's truly unfortunate. But I'd like to come back to
Mr. Blakey, 6 minutes.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We're here today because of a policy on the part of the Liberal government when it used prorogation, and Harper also used prorogation. Obviously, we'd like to have less controversial prorogations, and we'd like some accountability when it comes to the decision of proroguing Parliament. We've heard many differing opinions here on the reasons why prorogation happened this time. I'm very interested in this study, actually, and how it can serve as a precedent so that there's less abuse of that power of prorogation. Several times, we heard that all roads lead to the Prime Minister. We know that the Prime Minister has the constitutional power to advise the Governor General to prorogue. However, we're talking about the reasons why that advice was given. We still have not heard the Prime Minister's viewpoint here, and we have not had an opportunity to question the Prime Minister. So my question to you is this: do you think it would be appropriate to do so, and if it would set a good precedent to invite the Prime Minister before this committee in order to participate in this study?
Monsieur Taillon, puis
Mr. Taillon, and then Mr. Bratt. Well, if the committee invites the Prime Minister and the Prime Minister accepts, obviously that would be a good thing. However, it's important to understand something. You said that the Prime Minister has the constitutional power to advise the Governor General, who represents Her Majesty. That's not necessarily the case. That's not in a constitutional text. That relationship that the Prime Minister has with the Governor General actually is supported by convention, not necessarily by written texts. And that's actually the heart of what I'm saying. You have to be careful. We have these vague, unwritten rules that have not necessarily been sanctioned by the courts. And so actually, this parliamentary power is sitting on very, very weak ground. Mr. Bratt.
A couple of things. One is I'm very pleased that this committee was formed to look at the August 2020 prorogation. I wish something similar had been done back in 2008 and 2010 when those occurred. I like conventions, constitutional conventions. I think the unwritten constitution is a great strength of the Canadian system. Maybe that's why I'm not a law professor, but we can look at Boris Johnson. In the fall of 2019, the Supreme Court of Britain did overturn a prorogation, but he was then allowed to bring in a smaller, shorter prorogation. So I think given the similarities between the British system and the Canadian system and the role of convention, that might be a case to look at and to investigate much further, and maybe bring in a British expert to the committee.
I think one of the things that we've heard is that in the Canadian context, in order to change those conventions, you need a constitutional amendment. And so, and even that strikes me as odd, because at that point you then have to write into the Constitution things that are not already there. So it's not a simple case of amendment. It's actually developing a constitutional mechanism to govern prorogation. Now, as Mr. Taillon said, I mean, you may be able to change these things because they aren't written and there is a fluidity to those rules, but you can only do that if the people in the positions of leadership, either the Prime Minister or the Governor General, him or herself, see fit to begin behaving in ways that don't conform to the established convention. So, what are some of the paths for Parliament to assert a larger role in decisions about prorogation?
I would argue that I agree that legislation would not work. It would require something stronger than legislation. So I think it is oversight. It is investigation into the actual reasons for prorogation, and then let the Canadian people decide. Ultimately, they are going to be the jurors on whether this was politically motivated or public policy motivated. And so that's where I would turn.
Monsieur Taillon, est-ce que vous avez...
Mr. Taillon, do you have anything to add? Well, with your permission, in New Zealand and Australia, there are cabinet manuals for not necessarily changing conventions, but codifying them in a written manual so that we can all be familiar with them. So we're not necessarily talking about changing the Constitution, but taking a non-legal guide and codifying it. And then it has to be debated when it comes to adopting it. And then that can help us shed light on what to do in times of crisis. I know that my colleague Hugo Cyr argued before this committee about strengthening this through votes. Ultimately, though, your ability is limited.
Thank you. We're going to move into the second round. I think because we started a little bit late, I think we're going to go over a little bit, but we'll end at the end of the NDP in the middle of the second round. So Mr. Vecchio, Mr. Turnbull, then Mr. Terrien, and Mr. Blakey. That's who we'll hear from. Ms. Vecchio, go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Perfect. And thank you very much to our witnesses for coming today. I just want to turn back to some of the questions that my colleague John Nader was asking. And so I'm just going to start with a bit of a preamble because Dr. Bratt, you wrote in the Calgary Herald in September that, and I quote, "The speech from the throne was not about a reset due to COVID-19. Rather, it was an elaborate effort from the Trudeau government to distract Canadians from a political scandal." End quote. Do you still believe that's the case?
Yes.
Okay, so thanks very much. So starting with that, and I quote once again from this, "The real reason for the prorogation was the WE scandal," end quote. Since we are tasked with reviewing the government's reasons for prorogation, does it make sense that this committee should hear from these types of witnesses?
Absolutely. And I would go back and revisit some of the testimony that had previously done around the WE scandal with the Kielburger brothers. If you had watched their interviews on the Fifth Estate a couple of weeks ago, I think you might get a very different testimony than what they delivered back in July.
You're absolutely right. I know, Dr. Bratt, that I have watched it, and I totally agree. I've sat there and paid attention to it, and you do see the story change and becoming a little bit more open on some of the feedback on that. So including the Kielburgers, are there any other, we've mentioned the Prime Minister should be coming here. Does Dr. Bratt and Professor Talon agree that the Prime Minister should both be here? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. And Dr.
I would and Katie Telford as well, and many of the other same witnesses that you had around WE.
So we're looking at the WE. Would you include the Speaker Spotlight, the people that organize the Speaker Spotlight, and they have the information and data showing who was paid, which members of the Trudeau family were paid during this time with WE?
Yeah, I think that's an important aspect. I don't think it's the only one. I mean, that was a big revelation when we found out that Justin Trudeau's mother and brother were being paid. But even before that, people had to have known, should have known, just the very close connection between Trudeau and the WE charity. I think it's less about the money than how closely they were connected.
Absolutely. So as we're studying prorogation, it's not just about the Prime Minister and his final say, but we should probably investigate a little bit further, is what I'm hearing from you, Dr. Bratt.
Yeah, because that's, in my view, that's the reason for the prorogation. So you're going to have to dig deeper into figuring out, well, why did they want to delay and change the channel? And quite frankly, I think prorogation worked in that respect. It did change the channel. We're only talking about WE in the last couple of weeks, but throughout the fall of 2020, it did move off the pages.
Well, it sure did. And I know that just the other day we heard from Pablo, who is our House Leader, of course, for the government, where they talked about we were not filibustering, but we saw that in so many of our committees, the moment that you brought up everyone became a little bit prickly and really did not want to go there again. They wanted to close that door. And I know that others, that idea that, well, that was months ago. Well, it's months ago, but unfortunately, I think it may be a pattern that we're seeing under this Prime Minister. And that's very, very concerning.
It might be tougher to do, but I would love to see Bill Morneau back.
Okay.
He is a private citizen now, but he resigned in between. And so what was the link? I would think a finance minister would love to be involved in dealing with resetting the Canadian economy and the finances after hundreds of billions of dollars of spending. This would not be the time to leave unless the Prime Minister had no confidence in you.
Absolutely. And I think that we all saw that, unfortunately, on August 17th. We did see that that division of a very long time standing friendship that was gone. Are there any other way, like in a case, and I'm just going to ask for your own background, in the case that we've continued to ask these, the Prime Minister, Katie Telford, the Chief of Staff, Mr. Morneau, Bardish Chagger, some other important people, what should we do next if they do say no? I mean, they have the prerogative to say no as being members of Parliament. What should we be doing next?
I'm not sure what you can do to force them in there outside of identifying that they were requested and they chose not to appear.
Okay. And summoning the other witnesses, is that a possibility?
Keep doing that. Yeah.
Keep doing it.
More information is better.
Okay, and that's exactly what I want to look at. Dr. Talon, Professor Talon, do you believe it's also important to have the Kilburgers and other witnesses on here to show the link between prorogation and the scandal? What are your feelings on that?
C'est important là, ce qui est arrivé.
Well, what happened with the We Charity is an important issue. And this parliamentary investigation should be able to continue. And MPs have procedures they can use to relaunch an investigation if they want to. However, I don't know that one should circumvent the work of a committee on prorogation and turn that into an investigation into the issue.
Thank you both very, very much. Thank you.
Mr. Turnbull, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to both the witnesses for being here today and sharing your perspective. Greatly appreciate it. And maybe Mr. Bratt, or Professor Bratt, I'll start with you. I wanted to ask you just a point-blank question to get a short answer response if possible. Let me ask you this. Would you expect a government to abandon its values and priorities because of a pandemic?
No. I mean, sometimes you're going to have to reverse course and you're going to have to do things in the general interest that may go against your ideology. And I think we've seen that with a host of governments throughout the pandemic, that they have, I actually would argue we've worked better together than we normally do in this country.
Okay, thanks. So wouldn't one then expect that a new speech from the throne would have some continuity or be largely similar in some respects to a previous speech from the throne?
It would, but in this was not a normal speech from the throne. This was a speech from the throne that came on the heels of a prorogation. And so mentioning things like childcare, which is linked to the pandemic, and pharmacare, which can be linked to the pandemic, should have been linked in a much more explicit fashion.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So you've gone actually further to say that in your opening remarks that the new speech from the throne didn't have much substance, to quote you. I have your written remarks here, so I circled that, and I found that kind of strange from my perspective because I know how much extensive consultation went into formulating a new speech from the throne. So what I wanted to ask you is, have you done an analysis of the speech from the throne in comparison to the previous one?
I have not done that. I have listened to lots of speeches from the throne in the past.
Thank you. Well, I have, and I just wanted to ask you, were you aware that the new speech from the throne had a focus on building back better, that wasn't even a part of the political lexicon, as far as I know, in terms of a key message prior to the pandemic. Would you say that's true?
Putting in a phrase is not the same as developing a set of policy and policy ideas. And so,
Agreed.
yeah, coming up with a catchphrase is not the same thing.
Okay, well, I mean, I see that as much more than a catchphrase, but you're free to disagree, of course. So what about the mention in the very significant section on systemic racism and addressing that? There's a very large section on addressing systemic racism, something that's definitely been highlighted in this throughout the pandemic. Would you say that that wasn't, like that was a new feature in the throne speech that wasn't there in the previous one? So would you say that's true? Would you acknowledge at least that that was new?
That had been further developed than what we had seen in the previous throne speech.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So there was some new developments. So it's, your claim about not much substance. What about the long-term care, the national standards for long-term care? I mean, to me, this is something that's emerged as a major priority coming out of the pandemic and the failures that we've seen across the country in long-term care.
Well, and the problems with that, of course, is jurisdiction. And so, yes, talking about long-term care that is in the avenue of the provinces is also problematic, which is why there is a section in my opening statement that I didn't read, but was distributed about why many of the premiers were also upset with the throne speech for other reasons.
Well, I certainly recognize there's jurisdictional challenges, but the point I'm trying to ask you about and make is just that wasn't in the previous speech from the throne because the pandemic actually raised that issue. So in fact, there was at least, in my view, at least 3 or 4 major things in the speech from the throne that were not in the previous one that emerged as a result, as priorities as a result of the pandemic. The other one that I would reference for you is the support for the hardest hit sectors, which is certainly something that was featured in that speech, among many other things. So, I just would say, from my perspective, the speech had a lot of substance to it. Perhaps maybe not from yours, but I think there's evidence to the contrary. I want to ask you another question about timing. I think the other pointed remark that you made was really creating a causal link between 2 things that happened in time. And I know from, studying science and understanding that, timing doesn't really necessarily create a causal link. Would you agree with that? Like my daughter didn't do her homework last night doesn't mean that's the reason I woke up grumpy this morning.
No, absolutely. It's all about the context of that timing and causal and determining whether there's a causal link. And I would think the resignation of the finance minister leading to prorogation the next day is a pretty good causal link.
Thank you, Professor Bratt. Monsieur Terrien, 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think it's pretty clear. Prorogation happened for political reasons related to the We charity. Now, Mr. Bratt, in your opening remarks, I saw what you had to say. Mr. Turnbull obviously is a Liberal, and so he's trying to tell us that there is a difference between the 2 speeches from the throne. Now, besides stepping into provincial jurisdiction, I don't think there was anything else that was new. Without putting words in your mouth, I'd like to ask you this, because you're experts, as well as to Mr. Taillon. Are there any marked differences that would lead us to believe that in the new speech from the throne, there were other motives to prorogue? That there was this reset that had to happen? Was that obvious in the speech from the throne? I'd like to hear you both on this. I think one has to make the distinction between the content of the speech and the result of this reset. The government claims that it was taking a new direction. Is that the case or not? Well, I don't necessarily have an opinion on that. I don't think actually that's the most important issue anyway. If the government wants to have a new speech from the throne, it can do that, and it can use prorogation to do that. But what is important is the outcome. And the outcome here was that everything was reset, including work going on in committees. One might imagine a situation where the government wants to have a new speech from the throne and set a new direction without necessarily proroguing. So you don't need to prorogue to shift your direction. And it's actually the very nature of our system. MPs and the government serve the general interest. And therefore, one does have to change policies. They can do that at any point in time. So I think it's actually what that reset does. Why does one reset? And why reactivate some things? And why close the door on some other things? So I think that those things are indicators of the reasons. One can look at the context, yes. One can't necessarily make that causal affection. But if you go back to the House and then there's no collaboration on continuing that investigation, then that does send out a signal about the purpose of the reset.
Professor. Mr. Blakey, 2.5 minutes.
So I want to come back to my initial question, but maybe in a new way. In 2015, we had a prime minister and a party that formed a new government that recognized the problem with abuses of prorogation. And their answer was to require a report to be filed after a prorogation. And I think we're seeing that answer comes up short in some ways, is better than what we had before, but it's not the gold standard. So in your view, a government that was really keenly determined to prevent future abuses of prorogation, what are some additional steps that such a government could have taken and could take now if they were really focused on the question of preventing abuse rather than talking about it after the fact? Mr. Taillon and then Mr. Brad, if we have time left.
Well, the most effective, efficient step would have been to restrict the time of that prorogation, the length of time, and perhaps eventually set new conventions. Now, I don't necessarily have the time to go over all those potential reforms one could use. But to be very clear, the length of time should be restricted, and I think that would be the best way to not necessarily deprive the government of that prorogation tool, but it would reduce the negative effects of that prorogation.
For us.
And I would also say this is not the first example, nor will it be the last, of opposition parties saying one thing and promising to do one thing, and then when in government doing something different. And so we see this, and particularly the differences between being in a majority and a minority government. Had they been in a majority situation in July of 2020, there would not have been as good committee work done as there was with a minority situation. And I doubt that this committee itself would have been formed if there was a majority government.
Thank you very much. I think that's pretty much it for my time, Madam Chair, and I know we've got some important business to discuss.
It is. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'd like to especially thank the witnesses today for being here and being so thoughtful in your responses and very direct. So we will carry on now. You're free to sign off from today's meeting, but I'll have the rest of the members stay signed into the public portion of the meeting because we have the election of the first vice chair to take care of. So we'll have the clerk conduct that election.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you all. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Justin, the clerk. Will proceed with the election of the first vice chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1062, the first vice chair must be a member of the official opposition. I'm now prepared to receive motions for the first vice chair. Ms. Vecchio?
Hi, I'd like to put a motion forward to nominate John Nader.
Thank you. It's been moved by Karen Vecchio that John Nader be elected as first vice chair of the committee. Is it the pleasure of the committee to adopt the motion? I declare the motion carried and Mr. John Nader duly elected first vice chair of the committee. Congratulations, Mr. Nader.
Not that I had a vote, but I think I showed my cards there too. Welcome, Mr. Nader, to the position. We're happy to have you, like I mentioned earlier. Now, if I could have you all log off and log into the in-camera portion of the meeting, hopefully we can get through the draft report. Thank you.